Well, he's gonna have to.
Good afternoon, Mike.
Hi, Brian. I'm trying to get on some earphones here so I don't bother my wife. We're just in one big room. My Bluetooth phones don't seem to be working.
Now I'll go to the bedroom and close the door.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, you all.
Hello, all.
Hello, everybody.
I see 7 board members: Mike, myself, Jesse, Raymond, Rich, Susan, Roger.
Eric, I did hear from Ryan Hunter. He has a job commitment that's cropped up, so he may or may not be able to join you today.
Okay. So aside from Ryan, that would be Kathleen and Kyra that we are still waiting on.
Kyra was at the committee meeting this morning, so yeah, she certainly hasn't forgotten about her or anything.
Okay.
There she is.
There's Kathleen. Well, I mean, let's to keep it moving and in the interest of staying somewhat on time, why don't we get started? I think, Matt, do we have everybody from your side that we need? Okay. So we'll call the meeting to order then. This is the October 6th, 2021 meeting of the Board of Directors. We have a quorum present, so we'll get started. I think number 1 is to approve our agenda for the day. Get my little notebook out. I think, again, the only person we're missing, well, we're missing Ryan and Kyra at the moment. But I think everybody else is here. And again, for the sake of obeying the rules, state, when you say yes or no for the agenda, please state where you're calling it from. Mike?
Yes, and I'm calling from just outside of Gatlinburg, Tennessee.
Rich?
Yes, Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County.
Okay. Raymond?
Yes, Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County.
Jesse?
Yes, Ypsilanti, Washtenaw County.
Kathleen?
Yes, Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County.
Susan?
Yes, Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County.
I'm also a yes. Ann Arbor, Michigan, Washtenaw County. Oh, I'm sorry, Roger. Did I skip right over you? I sure did.
I'll turn it low.
Yeah, and I'm yes, Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County.
Thank you, Roger. Right. Next is public comment. I think Kelly, do we have anybody?
I've never
who
had that
is-
problem before.
Would you say, Mike? Okay.
I currently see no raised hands, nor have I received emails.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. We'll close public comment and go to general announcements. I don't think we have any general announcements. Anybody on the staff or board have any general announcements? Okay. Then we'll get to the reason we all came, which is the presentation of long-range plan scenarios. So I will turn it over to Matt and Forrest and their team of consultants there. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you on the board for agreeing to meet sort of off schedule. We certainly do appreciate it, and it helps keep this project humming and our ability to meet with the public intact over the coming months. So I'm going to say some introductory comments, contextualize things, and then introduce our lead consultant, who will then walk you through the rest of the information. So we're here today to provide the board with a preview of the first round one scenarios for our long-range planning process. Today, our goal is only to orient you to this complex information, to introduce it, to help you get your head around it, to answer any preliminary questions and get any initial feedback. But we will be spending additional time with you in upcoming committee and board meetings. I want to reassure you that this is only the starting process for this. You will have time to digest the information you're going to receive today, to come up with questions on your own time. It is important for us, however, that you see this information first before it begins publicly circulating in about 2 weeks. We will be moving to having a 1-month public feedback period on these scenarios starting on October the 18th. Very quickly, over the last several months, we've heard from you, the public, stakeholders, elected officials, and others about their general and specific aspirations for transit. We've looked at plans like the Ann Arbor's A20 and Transportation Master Plan, looking for guidance and the values of the community. We've done a lot of technical review. There's been a lot of data crunching, as you'll see. All of this has been in the service of how best to advance the board's ends, or as some people may think of them, the goals for the organization. Our next step now is to move this conversation forward into greater levels of detail. We've pulled all the information together and are now presenting some general scenarios in order to spur discussion and solicit feedback. These scenarios are intended as a straw man only. It's like a thought exercise to begin with. We're interested in your reactions to these and to the public's reaction. We think that this will help us learn things like how far the community really wants to go in pursuit of the ends goals the board has given us. What services you and the community like and don't like. What are you most interested in? It helps us get a better sense of priorities and trade-offs, the risk tolerance in various aspects of the community, and it also helps us to begin to assess the willingness to pay for additional services. All of these scenarios pursue the board's ends goals and comply with your executive limitations policies. But as you see, they gradually increase the amount of service provided and therefore the benefits produced, but they also increase our costs as they scale up. After this session with you, we'll release this information to some of our partners and stakeholders, and then release for public feedback starting October the 18th and running through November the 19th. We're already scheduling some presentations with some of our municipal partners, and I may reach out to some of you board members to accompany us on those visits. I also want to reiterate that this is an iterative process. Lots of time for the board to weigh in. This is just the beginning of the discussion. Once we have completed this round of feedback, the staff and consultants will pore over the results, things we hear from you today and from the public later. We'll make adjustments and bring forward another more focused proposal, iteration 2, round 2, if you will. Again, starting with you, we'll broach those discussions. From there, we'll work with you and the communities and the public to further refine these ideas until we have a final long-term vision for services that the board can accept. After that, we'll have our blueprint for the future, yay, and we can begin aligning our internal processes and resources to achieve those goals. A lot of the details are going to be forthcoming after that stage. So we're not going to be giving you route maps today with turns by turns for Route 15. That would come at a later stage. In closing, all of this, I just want to reiterate, is about our 25-year plan for the year 2045. There are a lot of immediate discussions that have been having even in committee this morning about more immediate concerns like millage or immediate budget pressure. We want to set that aside for this discussion today and focus on the year 2045. Some of the information you're going to see in this PowerPoint still needs a little cosmetic processing before it goes public, but we have a little time for that. So please bear with us. There is a lot of information coming up today. You may feel at times like drinking from a fire hose, but we do have some pauses built into the presentation for you to catch your breath and ask questions. And as a reminder, today is intended only as an introduction, and we will have lots more chances in the coming weeks for you to hit us with new questions. With that, I'd like to introduce our consulting team of Left Turn, Right Turn, and I will turn it over to their lead, Mr. Yuval Greenspan, to take you through the rest of the information. Take it away, Yuval.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you to the board for having us today. Just going to pause for a second as our deck comes up. If you can share the screen now, that's great. Thank you. I just want to acknowledge, the rest of the team is here as well, or others from the team, Dennis, Ben, and Pia. And together with your staff, we've been working quite diligently to get ready for this meeting, as well as for the public engagement and all of the analysis and effort that's gone underway. Just in terms of, just to recap sort of key objectives from our perspective for today, really it's about sharing with you the materials that we're planning to take to the public. As Matt mentioned, many of the slides are as they will appear to the public, and then others are still to be tweaked and massaged in terms of messaging and cosmetics. We definitely are interested in collecting your preliminary thoughts on scenarios and concepts that you're going to see here. And we recognize that this is just the first conversation on those, and that there will be others. Central to that is, one of the key things that we're looking to gauge from all of the engagement that we're doing with stakeholders in the public is around finding the right balance between costs and benefits for your community, and recognizing that this is the beginning of that process and that discussion. And then also related to this is understanding what general or specific feedback you as a board would like to hear from the public, so that we can adjust our survey methodology, we can adjust the questions, and ultimately, if need be, make small adjustments to the presentation to make sure that we are collecting the right information to enable you as a board to make strategic decisions for your organization. Given the quantity and density of the materials, as Matt has alluded to, drinking from a fire hose, so given the quantity and density of that and how much we have to cover, I will do my best to move us along and appreciate your support and patience on that. Please, if there's any clarifications on something on a slide, I welcome that at the time. But then if you have any more specific thoughts or questions around the ideas, if you're okay with it, I would ask that you just wait until the demarcated points where we've scheduled time to have the discussions. All of that with the intent and just really wanting to make sure that we do get you through the full material and get us and have us able to hear your thoughts throughout. So we'll move on to the next slide, and the first slides here are going to be quite quickly. We'll move quite quickly through, but really you can see for the public, which has had very little visibility into the plan, we're going to have some slides on the long range process, the planning process, the goals and measures, and then we're going to talk about the different elements of the plan, and that's where you as a board probably want to fixate most of our time today, and that's what we'll try to quickly get to. And then ultimately that discussion and next step. So this is just one slide, and maybe we'll just pause for 20 seconds on each of these, just to give you a sense of what we're going to show the public. You know, you've seen something like this previously, laying out the different areas that the RIDE 2045 is going to be working on, or looking at, I should say, in terms of as a long-range planning process. The next slide, which shows the overall phasing that we have and timelines. And so right now we are in that phase 3. We met with you earlier on at the tail end of phase 1 to talk about guidance, and then to share some of our initial thoughts on current state and future state, and where the community is building towards. So right now we're at this phase 3, and on the next slide we actually share a little bit more detail in terms of the engagement that's going to be planned. And you can see the language is, of course, geared towards public and stakeholders. You know, why are we here today? And it's really about getting, you know, all of these external partners and individuals to provide their insight as to what they think that the transit system in the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti should look like in 2045. There will be 2 rounds of engagement, as Matt alluded to, and it connects to the development process for the plan. So in the first round of engagement that's coming up now, starting in later this month, we're going to be sharing the scenarios, if you will, different concepts and ideas that will ultimately need to be worked into a singular plan. And then in between and following this first round, that's when we are going to take all of the feedback that we've received from the public, from the stakeholders, and of course from you folks on the board, and use that to develop a single recommended approach, a draft final plan, if you will. That's what becomes the focus for that early 2022. Right now, we are targeting January for that, subject to being, us all being ready for that and the discussions. But that's where we'll share sort of the draft final plan in terms of what we think the specifics will be, and then use all of the input from that to finalize and then start to work on implementation considerations. How do we stage this out over time? And what are the financial requirements to make this plan successful? So that's all geared for early 2022. Moving on, we'll go into the next section, which talks about the goals and the measures for the plan. Starting with the goals on the next slide. And here, this is language that is, we framed it as in the way that we think the public would most understand it. But ultimately, we view it as a summation of the guiding framework, which of course is based on your ends. And so what it's speaking to is, increasing social equity by improving access to jobs and housing, helping the environment and the economy through the development of transit infrastructure that supports those goals, supporting more compact and vibrant places for residents and attracting business. And so those are obviously very much aligned, language that probably harkens back to your ends, if as you're familiar with them. And in terms of the metrics, of course, you have visibility through the appendices that we've provided to a lot more detailed metrics that we're using. But for the public, it's really important for them to understand that 2 really key metrics that we look at when we're talking about transit plans is ridership and ridership per capita, which, again, for us, for this audience is more familiar, but for someone newer to transit or not working in the space, they would just need to understand those key concepts. Just one thing worth noting on that, on the goals, is that a lot of the municipal plans that you have call for and require for more transit services and higher transit ridership. So, A20 is something that we'll speak to later on. And so as we talk through the scenarios, and we'll pause on this slide for a second, as we talk through the scenarios, we'll reference those plans, because quite frankly, some scenarios do better in terms of being aligned with and delivering on some of the visions that you have in those plans. So this slide, what it's intended to show and explain to stakeholders and the public is the importance of of using scenarios to really gauge people's feedback to different elements. So we've created hypothetical scenarios. They explore different ideas and generate feedback. And there's different ways of building scenarios. In our case, we decided we wanted to really build them based on increasing levels of investment and associated benefits. And really, one of the key reasons we structured the scenarios in this way is, as I mentioned earlier, to explore the community's willingness to invest. And so we'll get into that in a moment in terms of what those look like. But ultimately, it's important to note that while the scenarios are focused on fixed route services, they do capture and do factor in all of the other services that TheRide presently offers and ultimately should offer or considers what TheRide should be offering in the future. And that, yeah, as that last bullet mentions, with any scenario-based approach to planning, you expect to do, and you know, there will be iterations. There were iterations that led to this point, and based on the feedback that we get from yourselves and others, you know, there will be further iterations and refinement to ultimately leading to a single recommendation. So I'm going to pause there before we get into the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the session. I know I went through those rather quickly, but it was all related to, you know, this is all context to the plan and very much echoes what I had shared before. But I want to pause there and see if there's any immediate questions around the process or timelines or anything like that before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of the scenarios.
Just jump in if you have a question. I can't see everybody at once, so don't wait for me to call on you. Just jump in.
I have a question about the measurements to be made regarding my ridership.
Go ahead.
And obviously total ridership, I think is fairly straightforward, but talking about ridership per capita, particularly with Ann Arbor having grown its employment so much more than it's grown its population. And certainly some of the people who live outside of our service area drive in and park someplace and then use public transportation. And presumably the growth in employment is still going to continue to exceed population growth. And so I'm sure you guys have faced situations like this before in your consulting activities. And I'm just wondering how you reconcile just keeping the denominator being population and not trying to work in some way, although I can't think of off the top of my head how you would do it, but work in some way the people who live outside the service area who still use the services and put that into the measurement too.
Thanks for the question. So through, you know, I talked about the 4 phases of the project, and in phase 2 of our project, we spent quite a bit of time analyzing both what I would characterize the current state. How does performance of the service right now look like? What does the population and employment characteristics of the community look like? But then we also then spent quite a bit of time as well analyzing, researching, modeling, and forecasting what the future state, what will the community look like in 2045? And we look at it from the perspective of employment, how many new jobs will be coming to the area or the region, you know, what is the population going to change like, what do travel patterns look like, and how are those evolving? And then looking at as well, what's happening in the surrounding region. We actually have on our project website right now, the current state and future state summary, and it actually summarizes a lot of those key facts for, you know, not just yourselves, but anyone in the public or stakeholders that are interested in seeing what are some of those key changes to the surrounding community. And so ultimately, when we talk about ridership per capita, we're basing it based on what we forecast or expect the population to be in the area in 2045, using our best judgment and based on the data that we have found.
But it doesn't sound like you're going to in some way make the ridership per capita measurement reflect somehow the growth, the people who don't live in the area. The denominator is going to be the population, period. Is that right?
No, when we look at ridership, we look at not just ridership from people, residents in the community, but all riders of the
Yep.
service. And so we
Yeah,
take that.
But I'm talking about the denominator, not the numerator.
If I might jump in, because I think I understand Mike's question. The answer, Mike, is going to be, it depends. As you see, when we get to the section on park and ride and regional services in Yuval's presentation, there are a couple different ways to skin this cat, but that larger service area could be ours. It could be the RTA's. We certainly aren't going to put the population of the entire west side of Metro Detroit into our denominator and claim it's ours. That doesn't seem right. Let's focus on the service strategies to get there and how we measure it. That's something we can haggle out later.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions on process? All right, so we'll move on. I'm just going to find myself on the slides. Thank you. Okay, great. So as I referenced earlier, we took a scenario-based approach to this planning exercise. We've ultimately landed on 4 scenarios, and these scenarios focus on fixed route bus service primarily, but underlying each are designs that include other important elements such as demand response, the flex ride and night ride services. They consider requirements for upgrades to infrastructure, whether that's garage space, terminal upgrades, Blake Transit Center or Ypsilanti Transit Center or other terminals, bus stop infrastructure. The scenarios also account for fleet changes and new technologies and customer amenities. All of those things, in a sense, are baked into these scenarios. And the scenarios really envision increasing levels of investment to attract riders. And you can see how we've laid it out on this slide, and we'll get into the details. But that ultimately, these scenarios have increased reliability and frequency of service, faster and more direct service to reduce travel times, better access to transit and improved accessibility. And really what we're talking about, scenario 2 is going to perform better than scenario 1 in all of those aspects. And scenario 3 will perform better than scenario 2, and scenario 4 better than 3, and so on. And as we talked about earlier, it's really based on this concept of testing. How much is the community looking to invest into transit? I just want to note up front that the intent of this process is really to hone in on the core services around which transit is built. So things like higher order transit, such as bus rapid transit, which I'll introduce later on for those that are less familiar with it. Express or limited stop services and high frequency services. Those are really the backbone around which your network should be designed around. Local services are considered as well, and more broadly, but we recognize that the exact routing of those local services will be decided in the years to come, right? We're talking 25 years out. Designing down to which street a local bus should be going on, there's not much value in that, recognizing that that's going to change. And also in some cases, it might just be better served to a local area, might be better served with on-demand transit, or quite frankly, new delivery modes that will emerge over the next 25 years. And we're going to talk about the importance of really being responsive to emerging technologies and trends in the marketplace. So we're going to dive into the 4 scenarios now. And I'm going to speak for the next probably 15-20 minutes to try to go through these somewhat briskly. Again, I know there's a lot of information on here. Hopefully you've had a chance to at least glance at it before. But then ultimately after we've gone through these scenarios, then we'll pause and open up discussion on all four as a collective, if you will, look so that people can sort of compare and contrast what they thought on all four. And then ultimately, if there's other comments that need to be shared with us after, we'll collect that as well. So we'll move on and start with scenario one. Scenario one is your baseline, it's your status quo. It really just continues the current service that you have today and more or less the current structure that you have today in terms of your operations. It does consider small changes to routing that would improve performance, but overall there's not going to be any massive change or not even any significant change, I would say, to your network or rider or your service. And so when we're talking about this particular scenario, it probably doesn't perform well in terms of what it's delivering to your community. Transit quality is going to deteriorate in this scenario, because while your community is growing and your community is developing and there's jobs coming to the community, transit is staying stagnant. And ultimately, therefore, with this one, with scenario one, we're seeing or forecasting a decline in trips per capita or ridership per capita and transit mode share. And I think it's important to note that with scenario one, and I'll sort of reference this with some of the others, is it doesn't really align with the transportation policy that's been established in the area to reduce car mode share, right? 820 and other plans have set aggressive targets, an aggressive vision for shifting people to transit. Scenario one is not going to achieve that. On the next slide, we're showing travel times, and this is what a lot of customers are going to gravitate to. Flip to the next slide, please. I think one of our screens is frozen. Thank you. Yeah, so on this slide, you can see what many customers are going to be experiencing and really reflect on, which is what will their commute, what will their travel times look like? And in this case, this is, the current status, some trips are quite long. And what we saw in the current state analysis is that there's, especially in some areas, there's not much, when you compare it to auto travel, transit substantially performs worse in terms of travel times. And that's just a factor of how much service you're able to deliver, and that's all it's tied to. So ultimately, with this scenario here, we will see limited ridership increases and ultimately a stagnant service, which would result in a lower level of service. One thing we'd like to comment on is that, that's a little bit of creates a bit of a potential for what we've seen in other jurisdictions called the transit death spiral, which sounds as ominous as it is, where lower levels of service result in the, ridership losses, which then result in less political interest and thus less investments, which then circles back and you have less investment and less service. And so really transit starts to deteriorate. And so this scenario doesn't address your current issues like insufficient off-peak service, challenging connectivity and travel times for key travel flows, bus stop conditions, and schedule reliability. So you can tell, all in all, we're not terrible fans of this scenario. And as we get into some of the others, I think you'll see some more promising opportunities with those as well. So moving on to scenario two, this is the keep up.
Actually, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In that prior slide, you may have explained this and I missed it, but that last bullet point, a percentage with access to high frequency transit, where are those numbers coming from?
Sure, and maybe I'll actually turn it over to Ben to answer that.
Sure. So those numbers are coming from a 0.7 mile buffer of 15-minute frequency service or less in the peak period right now. And in terms of the population employment and where that data is coming from SEMCOG, their demographic information overlaid on network buffers of that service.
And
Okay,
when Ben uses the term buffers, what he means is basically if you draw like a 0.7 mile circumference or perimeter around where the service operates, that's what's captured. That's the population and employment that's captured within that area.
okay, so I understand that, but I guess I'm a little kind of questioning it, and I'm probably wrong, but for instance, like if we look at Pittsville Township, so if we assume that 0.10, the Carpenter Myers, so we're supposed to go 0.7 from there, a radius from that stop. Is that how I can view that then?
Well, and sorry, one thing to note that this is specifically around high frequency transit, which we're defining as 15 minutes or better service.
And another element of it is it's just including population within the member municipalities as well. So it's not including population within Pittsfield Township. Just the member municipalities.
Yeah, so we're only focusing with our analysis and metrics, we're focusing in terms of City of Ann Arbor, City of Ypsilanti, and Ypsilanti Township.
Okay.
That address your question?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have more questions later, but that helps answer that. Thanks.
And I do have one question regarding this same chart. The travel times on there, they are a representation of today, some point in the future. What is the time frame for those times?
Yeah, this is what the expectation would be around travel times in 2045.
Okay.
Which, would differ a little bit from today, but not substantially, I wouldn't think. And then as we get into the others, all of the other travel times are relative to this scenario. So in subsequent scenarios, when you see travel times in a percentage improvement, that's relative to this baseline.
Although I would certainly think that in 45 years that there will be a lot more congestion for cars because of cars, not because of buses.
Yeah. Any further questions or comments before we move on? And appreciate your holding back opinions. Clarifications are welcome. All right, so let's move on to scenario 2. So scenario 2 is the keep up with growth scenario, and really it's, we characterize it as the safe option. In this scenario, we're building on a 0.9% annual increase in service hours, which results in a 25% total increase over 25 years. And these investments, the investments here are more or less designed to be in line with projected population and employment growth. They might be a little bit more than that, but it was primarily designed around that. This scenario has increasing frequencies on half the routes during the off-peak service. So in other words, the map shows the 30 minutes or better pretty much across the member municipalities during peak, and then at off-peak, half the routes would have 30 minutes or better frequency. So you're getting improved off-peak frequent service as well. There's a small increase to the bus fleet for scenario 2, which would necessitate a small expansion to the garage or other allocation of space in another facility to house those extra buses. The network here is simplified to ease use and improve efficiency. And one thing in particular that we try to undertake through scenarios 2, 3, and 4 is to start to move away from loop and branch routing, which is generally speaking a good practice when you can avoid it in transit planning. One thing we're interested in around scenario 2 is that we've started to introduce express services, and so you see the north, south, and east-west express service, which will really create faster travel options for those corridors. And we have upgrades to the YTC and BTC built into the scenario 2. I talked about some of those other elements factored in. We also have expansion of TheRide here to cover the full service area in member municipalities. And we start to introduce transit priority measures, which I will talk about in a couple slides. So in conjunction with what we expect to have, or which is transit supportive development from the communities and measures to optimize service and improve service quality, we expect to see growth in ridership here in this scenario that exceeds the population growth, which thus translates to an increased transit mode share. That said, it would be a relatively small increase in the transit mode share, and so it's probably not aggressive enough to be, to say that we are aligned in this scenario with some of the other plans that we referenced earlier.
So that was one question I had. When you say slightly fewer people driving cars, I assume you mean slightly fewer people per capita, not fewer overall.
Yeah, sorry, that's correct. We're talking about the transit versus automobile mode share. So there would be a shift here. It would not be a dramatic shift. We share some of the numbers later on. But yeah, it's not a dramatic shift here.
And while I'm talking, the express service, is that like point to point, or is that like the reduced number of stops, but still with multiple stops along the way?
Yeah, it's the latter. It would be a limited stop. It's limited stop, and then high. In this case, we're talking about a 10 minutes or greater frequency during peak for that.
And then this is Raymond. Do you anticipate interlining those routes as well?
Yeah, so the specifics around interlining are something that would come out later on in the detailed planning of the routes. At this point, we assume, or we develop based on coverage that we need and frequencies, and then service hours. It's worth noting that routes are generally longer to reduce the need for interlining, but that ultimately, if there's a benefit to interlining, that would be introduced during the specific route building stage.
I have a question about more individuals living in poverty. Are you describing the students of EMU and U of M? Because that'll be something that will nail us when we go out in public. Are you saying that 35,000 people in our community are living in poverty who are not students?
Sorry, that comment is more that more individuals living in poverty will have access to higher frequency transit. So we're not, we took the numbers from other data sources around what the community demographics will be around poverty. We're talking about how many people living in poverty have access to high frequency transit.
No, I think I'm sorry, I didn't speak well. In our community, that figure of poverty is often gauged by census data, and it often refers to students because their parents are subsidizing them. And is this capturing the student population? Because again, these are not people earning money themselves.
Right. So that data is coming from the American Community Survey. We can go back and check if it, how it treats students. Unless
I think it's important, given Ypsi Township and Ann Arbor, that we clarify that before we go out to the public. And the other question I think that we may get is the map isn't clear. Is it express service serving the university, or is it express service serving the community? Is it express service to Blake, or is it express service to the hospital? And I think we're likely to get that question about at least the lines as they're being drawn at this point.
Right. So there's definitely the express services would go into the transit centers, and then the specific routing is something we're still, as we move through this process, is what needs to be developed. But the intent is to try to capture with the express services, with the high frequency, with the bus rapid transit that you'll see later on, you try to capture as many of those major nodes as possible. And so to the extent that we can bring that express by the hospital campus and down into the Blake, that would improve usage of those routes.
So hospital first, then Blake, is what I'm hearing?
Yes. Yeah. We good to move on?
Yeah.
Thank you, folks. So on the next slide, we summarize the travel time impacts and some of the other impacts of this scenario. So, in summation, there's more direct connections that are created by scenario 2. We have better connectivity between major nodes. One thing I didn't mention on the previous slide that I'll just touch on here is we actually introduced 2 new transit centers that are also are also considered in scenarios 3 and 4. And the new transit centers would be at Briarwood Mall and Nixon Plymouth. And so together, this direct connectivity, the longer route structure, the introduction of Express, they all help to reduce the overall travel time. And so you see an overall average reduction of 12%. Average reduction isn't as useful as some of those more specific metrics that you see in the actual map itself. Transit priority and express, or transit priority, I should say, is also another key element to that helps reduce the travel times. The introduction of these within this plan, whether it be dedicated lanes or some of the other priority measures that I'll talk about on the next slide, are obviously an important feature. And so just generally speaking, through scenario 2 and subsequent scenarios, we're seeing much better connectivity between Northeast Ann Arbor and South Ann Arbor, between Northeast Ann Arbor and the Ypsilanti area, and Western Ann Arbor with, generally speaking, across the community, Northeast Ann Arbor, South Ann Arbor, Southeast Ann Arbor, and Ypsilanti are all much better connected to Western Ann Arbor through this and subsequent scenarios. So on the next slide, we want to take a moment to talk specifically about transit priority. We introduced it in scenario 2, and it takes increasing prominence in subsequent scenarios. Transit priority, as you may be familiar with, is what it does is it prioritizes the movement of transit vehicles over private automobiles. And there are different strategies, different tools that are used in this regard. Transit signal priority, which is giving transit vehicles preferential treatment at stoplights using some form of communication to give them an accelerated green signal so they can get through. Queue jump lanes, like shown in the image there, or even dedicated transit lanes are all important aspects to just improving transit travel speeds, which also leads to transit being more efficient. And then equally important is they lead to transit being more reliable. And what I mean by that is it reduces the variance in terms of travel speed. And so by reducing the, how much variability there is in that travel speed, you're able to predict and give customers much better information around when a vehicle will be there, which makes the service more reliable. And all of that to say, transit priority is an important tool in helping transit compete with private automobiles, which thus results in significant ridership growth. Dedicated bus lanes on the next slide is, one thing in particular that we wanted to call out. It improves speed, reliability. It makes the service more attractive. Something that you'll see in many communities is that they'll reclaim space from private automobiles or alternatively from parked vehicles. In some cases, for services operating on freeways or interstates, some communities will even use shoulder lanes, the shoulders to provide transit priority. You can provide dedicated bus lanes at choke points, like in a downtown setting, or along an entire corridor, like BRT, and we'll talk about that later. For TheRide, one of the specific things that we've been considering is the opportunity to partner with the University of Michigan to bolster the value that you could get out of a dedicated bus lane in some of the service areas where you both operate. It should be noted that right now this is all very early stages, and so the specifics of transit priority would be determined together with the municipal partners. So on the next slide, what you see there in terms of highlighted areas, these are areas that we've identified that have good potential for some form of priority, whether it's the dedicated bus lanes or signal priority or queue jump lanes. We've identified these based on current and projected traffic conditions. So that was a comment earlier about, how are we considering traffic evolving over time? So we've looked at some of that as well, some of that data to influence where we think these lanes should be, as well as the bus capacity and demand projected to serve these areas. and ultimately where we think giving priority treatment would have the most benefit to efficiency and service quality. Okay, thanks for keeping up. Scenario 3. Now we're starting to get into the really exciting stuff. Scenario 3 introduces modest improvement to your services. You know, in fact, what we describe some of these changes as structural changes that will make a sizable impact to your community and to way transit is operated. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is shortly. At the broadest sense, scenario 3 includes 1.9% annual increase in service hours, which translates to a 60% increase in service hours over 25 years. So we're talking about a 60% increase in how much transit you're putting out on the streets by 2045. In this case, you have a 30-minute frequency across your network at all time of day, both peak and off peak. If you may recall, on the last scenario, half of the routes had 30-minute frequencies. Now, all of your routes have 30-minute frequencies off peak, which means that customers can truly rely on transit at all hours of day. And you know, I would like to think that would be an impetus to get rid of their car and just to use transit. Another key element that's introduced in scenario 3 and 4 is that your service span is extended. And what we mean by that is the hours of service in which transit is provided to the community. And so in this scenario, you're now offering fixed route service until midnight, Monday through Saturday, and until 11 p.m. on Sundays. Of course, this will require more substantial investments in your fleet and a new facility to house those vehicles. I talked about structural changes, and one of the key structural changes to this service in scenario 3 is the introduction of a Brt system. In this case, we're calling for a Brt light along Washtenaw. And I call it Brt light because we aren't necessarily expecting to or capture or calling for a fully dedicated lane. You might have other transit priority features such as queue jumps or transit signal priority to boost the speeds, but you wouldn't necessarily have a fully dedicated lane in this scenario. The other key structural change here is the introduction of what we're calling a high frequency network. This is a network of routes that provides 15 minutes or better service for customers. And we'll come back to those two key things. I'll talk about why they're critical on the next slide, but just keep those things in mind, the Brt light and the high frequency network. Other two changes or two things I wanted to mention on this scenario before we move on. One is, again, this scenario calls for upgrades to the YTC and BTC, but here we're also seeing calling for increased spending on just broader bus stop facilities and other infrastructure investments to make the waiting experience better regardless of where you are. And also TheRide here is expanded to 100% service coverage across the member municipalities. So that's another significant change. All right, so I promised to come back to this comment around structural change, and we'll do it as it relates to travel times. And I want to do it here because you notice a substantial improvement or reduction in overall trip durations for customers. And the reason for that is the introduction, as I mentioned, of Brt and high frequency services. What those things do is they give you as a service provider, when you're designing your service, more places to connect people with in the direction they need to go. In the current model, the way the ride is currently built, most connections happen at the Blake Transit Center or the Ypsilanti Transit Center. And so that means more people are having to come to those locations and then transfer out, and so backtracking in some cases in the direction that they're traveling. Once you have that high frequency and Brt service introduced, you can connect at any of those locations, thus reducing how much people are backtracking. And so that just leads to dramatic improvements in travel times. We also have here in this scenario longer routes, which I talked about earlier, and which create more direct connectivity where people don't have to transfer. And so those things all together just lead to the reduction in travel time. And the reduction in travel time, of course, makes transit more competitive with the automobile, which thus increases ridership and increases transit mode share. We also, on the next slide, show an expansion in terms of where we want to give priority treatment to transit. So there would be more bus lanes, more transit signal priority, particularly for turning movements. That's a very important element where you use transit signal priorities on where transit vehicles have to turn, and as well as queue jumps strategically. On the next slide, we talk a little bit more detail about bus rapid transit, which was introduced in this scenario, and definitely comes it plays a much more prominent role as in scenario 4. And so I just want to take a minute to talk about BRT, and it's important to note that BRT comes in different flavors and configurations. But in all cases, really, BRT is designed to be an enhanced bus service. It uses transit priority to, whether it's dedicated lanes or other things, to really provide a much faster service. You have enhanced stops as well, so you wouldn't just have your typical transit stops. You'd have more expanded shelters that are more comfortable for customers to use. You'd typically enable or leverage off-board fare collection to make it possible for transit vehicles to be in and out of those stops at a much faster, which reduces the travel speeds and improves reliability. Agencies will often spend time marketing, developing specific marketing and branding, and create a very distinctive look for their BRT systems that really signifies to customers that this is a higher order form of transit. And so customers then start to gravitate towards that, which then enables dramatic growth in ridership. And of course, you'd see other types of vehicles, articulated vehicles, larger vehicles that can be used on those services as well. So in scenario 3, we have the BRT Lite, which I talked about, and then moving into scenario 4, you're going to see 2 fully featured BRTs planned. So let's go on to scenario 4. And scenario 4 is.
Sorry, could I ask well, no, maybe I'll let you finish this because this is probably going to be a longer question. So never mind, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, and we're just 2 slides away or 3 slides away from pausing and opening up the floor for broader discussion. So scenario 4 is really the large improvement scenario. It's the aspirational one that really, we'll call it shoots for the moon. It represents 2.8% annual increase in service hours compared to 0.9 and 1.9% on the other 2, on scenarios 2 and 3. And really what that translates to is a doubling in service by 2045. That increase in service is across the time of day, both peak and off peak. Obviously it'll necessitate a larger fleet and a new garage to support that larger fleet, much like scenario 3, but a little bit more so. I talked about the BRTs here. Really, the BRT play really prominent roles in driving ridership. These are BRTs that are planned to be on dedicated lanes. They'll have much greater improved travel times, and they'll really be competitive for people traveling by private automobile in that north-south direction or that east-west direction, who might be stuck in traffic and see the bus whizzing by in its own lane, right? This scenario also has a much more robust high-frequency network. And so, not surprisingly, all of these investments translate to much better performance in terms of outcomes. There are new transit centers called for here, Jackson, Maples, and Stadium, as well as Meyer Carpenter, as well as the upgrades that I've talked about previously. And so shifting on to the next slide where we talk about the outcomes of scenario 4, you see the
Just
further.
a quick- Sorry to interject. If you could go back to the last slide, I wanted to bring this up in scenario 3 and 4. It looks like a lot of the high frequency service routes follow the road network, but there do seem to be a few identified that don't. I assume that to mean that the exact alignment is maybe immaterial or to be determined. So for example, if in the city of Ann Arbor, right next to the letter C, there's kind of a straight line that doesn't align with the roadway per se. That might be similar to like the Pauline route. And then in Ypsilanti, I see a couple that kind of sprout out from the Y in Ypsilanti that don't look like they follow a road. Is that a fair assumption of mine to say that it's not following an exact roadway because you're not planning a route per se, but you just want a coverage in that area?
Yeah, that's exactly it. We're not calling for new roadways to be built there or anything like that. We tested various alignments there, and so the numbers and metrics that we're using are based on a few of those conceptual ideas. But ultimately, we don't have a specific alignment planned, nor do we need to at this stage for those. Down the line, that's where you would start to narrow in on where specifically those routes need to go. For now, for us, it's really just important to say we know we need to connect to those areas, and then the specific alignment can come after. And we know we need a high frequency service to connect those communities. But again, the specific roadway it takes might in fact be distracting to some customers. And so that's why we sort of showed that generalization. But good for you for spotting that. I appreciate the question. It's a good one.
And then thank you for that. One other quick question is, I appreciate the work here. Some roadways have different constraints, right? So, when I look at State Street, for example, in this scenario, that road configuration changes quite a bit through the corridor. So I was just curious, have any of the constraints along those corridors been factored in or not yet? This is just high level, and we're looking at opportunities based on where we think we can draw ridership, not necessarily based on feasibility of how much right of way there is.
Yeah, I would say we, to a certain extent, we factored it somewhat, and specifically as it relates to transit priority, but also recognizing that this is 2045, and so there might be some runway in terms of being able to have discussions with the municipalities if there's specific small changes that are required. Any substantial changes that would impact the design, those have been factored in. But then more broadly, we tried not to set too many constraints around that.
Okay, thank you.
So let's just talk about the outcomes for scenario 4 on the next slide. And then we'll quickly get to the slide where we can pause and open up the floor for feedback. As I mentioned, all of these changes result in substantially better outputs, which you would want and expect when you talk about investments in transit. So the network, so there's a robust high frequency network along with the 2 BRT spines. They create just better connectivity for customers. And then customers, because of that, have the ability to travel not just in any one direction, but in multiple directions from any given location, which is really important. So the result from all of that is a more reliable, more convenient, and faster transit service that's able to serve different travel patterns, right? And so this really translates to, we would say, and we talked about this being the visionary scenario, the aspirational scenario. This one really leads to that paradigm shift within how transit is used in the member municipalities. The amount of ridership goes up, faster than the growth of the community, which just translates to a much more, substantial shift in transit mode share and just how transit is viewed. And so in some ways, we would say this scenario is the most in line with the aspirational vision that's set out in some of those other municipal plans, such as 820, which are calling for, we'll call it transformational change. This one is the most in line with that.
Can you speak to why, if I'm looking at some of the routes, or not, I mean, they're not routes, but the travel times in Ypsilanti versus Ann Arbor, we're seeing like, why are they like half as fast in Ypsilanti? Is that because of transfers? Is that because like some sort of like mode share? But I'm just seeing like the one to number 10 is 29 minutes as opposed to, from 1 to 9 is 28 minutes, but twice the distance.
Oh, sorry, I see. You're comparing 1 to 9 and 10. So something like
Yeah.
1 to 9 would benefit from the BRT, which has, again, we forecast having dedicated lanes, and just, limited stop. It's, it's ultimately those long routes with short travel times are really benefiting from the BRT system, right? So especially 1 to 9, those are the endpoints of that BRT, versus 10 to 11. Or 11 to 10, I should say, would be on one of the high frequency services, but would not necessarily be an express route or a BRT service. So it's going through neighborhood streets, it has lower travel speeds, more stops, that type of thing.
So 1 to 9 looks like that would actually it would be circumventing downtown.
Yeah, those aren't the specific alignments 1 through 9, right? Like that's
But just in terms of trying to understand how it because I mean, BRT notwithstanding, traveling downtown just takes a minute.
Right. Yeah, like if you look at the alignment on the previous on the previous slide, you would see the more typical expected alignment for that BRT.
Okay.
And it does pass through. It would be planned to pass through the BTC. So in that sense, it is going downtown. But again, this is calling for a dedicated lane to help you get through downtown faster, so that the bus is not stuck in traffic. Granted, there might be more stoplights, but again, transit signal priority could help the vehicle pass through those stoplights with less impact. I just want to make sure we get through and have time to open the door, or open the floor, not open the door, to more questions, open the door too. So let's just pause briefly on slide 24, please, which is the bus lanes and transit priority features. So here, again, just further calling for additional features. Specifically, we would expect the BRT bus lanes. So for the BRT services. Yeah, and that's, I think, probably all I'll mention on this, just in the interest of time. So, all right. I know I've thrown a lot at folks. We'll go to the next slide and pause here for maybe 15 minutes or so. Just, I want to make sure we do have some time to get through the other slides as well. But I want to open up the floor to general thoughts in terms of what you've seen, what your thoughts are on these scenarios, what you like or don't like, and things that you'd like us to consider as we take this away and further refine.
I'll go with the question I was going to ask earlier. Now, I'm a big fan of the concept of BRT, but one criticism that I've read of BRT is that it takes so much planning and coordination amongst multiple authorities to implement that the projects end up taking so long and costs get bloated that in a lot of cases, it would have been better to just invest those resources in more fundamental things like increased frequency, bus amenities, better stops. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, so I mean, absolutely, BRT is a substantial investment, but at a certain point, you need to introduce higher order transit to really take the next step, if you will. I mean, that's ultimately why we put scenario 2 the way it is. Like, if you're just looking to increase services, but more or less keep the same structure, then that's sort of your scenario 2. But once you get to a certain point in terms of having built up the service on routes and creating the demand on those routes, you need to introduce options that really reduce travel times. And sort of that's where BRT helps you achieve that. Obviously, if the demand was much greater, you could look at other things like LRT, but we don't necessarily think that the demand is quite there yet. And so really BRT is that option to help you achieve the speeds for those large movements that will be attractive to customers. And that's why in both 3 and 4, I mentioned the structural change, like all of those other services are connecting in to the BRT, because that's the design and the routing and the alignment that we've talked about captures most people's travel flows and travel patterns. And so by building those two, the one or the 2 BRTs, and then connecting into that, you're getting people to a fast corridor, taking them across the region very quickly, and then helping them get that last, the last mile if they need to, and you've dramatically achieved improved travel times.
And if I might build on that, Yuval, part of it also has to do, Jesse, with where are you getting the money? If your community has local funding to do all that stuff without going to BRT, wonderful. A lot of communities don't. Therefore, they have to go through a competitive process with the federal government, in which case it may take more time, but you get more money from them to build a small starts BRT system, for example. So especially for the big ticket capital items like dedicated lanes or reconfigurations to the roadway, like Raymond was suggesting, if you hit a point where you just can't reduce travel time anymore until you tear out that entire block and put it back in, that's a big price tag. And sometimes you have to go to the feds, and sometimes there's no alternative but taking a decade to do it.
I had two questions for you. The first is, I have little small things, and I don't want to take up, because we only have 15 minutes, the time today with the smaller things. How do I get you feedback on the smaller things? Some suggested language changes, for instance.
Yeah, that would be greatly appreciated. And I would say if you're okay to channel that through Forrest and Matt, and they'll pass it on to us, that would be great.
Okay. And then secondly, it is with the word transformational. I'm disappointed that what I'm seeing are enhancements on existing routes. And I've shared this before with the board. I'm disappointed that the only IPSI to downtown service we have is Packard. And as we're looking at all these different scenarios, none of them recover a downtown scenario where IPSI people can come to work in downtown. Again, it all goes through the university, and with no disparagement to the university, they're not tax paying. We are providing excellent service to a very important employer, and I'm very grateful to them. But I'm worried that a lot of the tax-paying businesses in downtown who are going to be asked to support the millage are not going to be seeing anything close to being transformational. And I guess this is the question: is this exercise simply to look at existing routes and determine if we have more service or faster service, or are there actually other future routes that might be considered? I'm not quite getting the transformational part of this.
And if you want me to piggyback, I mean, that's actually the reason why I asked my questions as to what those percentages were, because if this is supposed to be a long-term 25-year or longer look, I mean, Pittsville Township and the other areas, we have to expand, in my view. I mean, I live in Pittsville Township and I would love to ride the bus more. And my hope is that at some point in the future, I'll be able to, but this plan doesn't seem to really include that, which is why I'm like, that percentage of people that it reaches seems very high for our actual potential of who we should be reaching.
So yeah, so I can sort of, if I can tackle those 2 points separately, I'll come back to the question about Pittsfield. In terms of the connectivity, or in terms of the process that we used, we started from a blank map. So we didn't just take the current map and start to draw minor tweaks to it. So, if there is similarities to specific routes right now, that's because this current route's right now in the right place, I would say. But that we ultimately started from a blank map, looking at travel patterns, looking at where population will be, where people are going to be going, and saying what is the most efficient way to bring people from point A to point B across the member municipalities. And so I guess I'm a little bit confused in terms of your comment around only one connection to Ypsilanti, because there's other services we've introduced there, especially if you look at scenario 4, but also in scenario 3, there's the the BRT that's connecting the two in a much faster way, the two downtown.
But it stays on Washtenaw. It doesn't penetrate downtown. Right. You are skirting downtown, going to the hospital, and then after it serves the hospital, that BRT service then goes to downtown. So the question I'm asking is one of prioritization. And I don't see the transformational part if what we're doing is the BRT on Washtenaw, and Washtenaw doesn't come anywhere close to downtown. How does that benefit the downtown taxpayers?
Right. So the routing that we used for the BRT, or that we're looking at, is the most direct routing, and so has the fastest travel time. And that's really what you're trying to achieve with a BRT, is trying to be as direct as possible and get people from that location, from that node, if you will, to that other node, and then from the other node they can connect to the right option. Right. It's not, I think there's a in terms of best practices, you're trying to avoid having too many routes that are meandering to just capture as many points. You're trying to get people, you're trying to draw the lines and trying to draw the routes so that they're as direct as possible, hitting the major spots where the travel demand is, right? And so that's how it was designed, with that in mind. And so Packard wouldn't necessarily be the most direct route for
no. I'm saying with Packard stays the same, but it looks like the emphasis on scenario 3 and 4 is simply to add enhanced service for university employees. I'm missing the part where the community sees a benefit in this. I'm asking more broadly, are you envisioning new routes connecting Ypsi to Ann Arbor? Are there new routes, or is it simply enhancing travel times on existing routes?
So again, like, these are to the extent that there is correlation between some of these routes and some of the routes that you have today, that's a fact, that maybe some of the current routes are designed in the right space. And then ultimately the other aspect is just street configuration limits what you can do in terms of the design. Overall, from a performance perspective, with scenario 3 and 4, you actually have a decreased emphasis in how much of the travel and usage of the system is students. So while maybe it looks like on paper you're just providing an improved service for the university, that from a metrics perspective and a performance perspective, it's the rest of the community that is actually increasing disproportionately how much transit it's using as a result of this. I don't know if that helps, but we can certainly, and then in terms of, I guess the last thing I would say is, we'll take your thoughts and your feedback, and we're happy to dive further into alternative route options in the next go around, right? Like, I think that's ultimately the intent of this exercise. You're suggesting that maybe the BRT needs to go more directly.
No. You're hung up on BRT. I'm sorry if that is confusing you. I'm interested in serving the community of downtown Ann Arbor.
Got it.
And whatever technology is really, I'm not that interested, frankly. My interest is we have a parking sensitive location where we can charge a lot for parking, which means we can encourage transit use. It's dense, it's walkable, it's multimodal, and we're missing an opportunity if we don't use this 2045 plan to drive more transit users into and out of and through downtown. We're missing that opportunity if the only thing we're focusing on is shiny train, BRT vehicles. I couldn't care less about the vehicle. I'm interested in using the opportunity of a dense parking expensive place and using this 2045 plan to drive more transit use. And it doesn't seem transformational to me to see the existing routing, but just saying, well, it's going to go faster, or we're going to have more buses on that same route. I'm trying to figure out a way to connect Ypsi to downtown Ann Arbor. Right. And I don't see that in this. And I guess it's a question I'd like to think we can think through. If it's going to be a 20-year plan, I'd like to think there would be more than just Packard connecting Ypsi to downtown Ann Arbor.
We can take it away.
Yeah, could expand on that a little bit. I'm back at a previous set of consultants a number of years ago. They were first introducing BRT light on Washtenaw, and they were coming up with, I think, a 9-minute travel time savings, which was, on a 45-minute trip. And I asked them, well, was this because of signal prioritization or queue jumping? And they said, no, we just reduced the number of stops. So essentially, by reducing the amount of service or the number of stops, you get a travel time savings. I am very skeptical that because of that freeway interchange on Washtenaw, that you're ever going to be able to get very, very good travel times through that section of, say, between Stadium and the freeway exit. It's just a parking lot, and if you think you're going to be able to take out a lane of traffic in each direction to make a bus lane, I don't want any part of that political fight. So I actually think you could probably make better travel time using Packard, because there is no freeway exit on Packard. So yeah, if there were true BRT and it went to downtown, that sounds like a great idea, but that's not what you're really suggesting here. And suggesting that there ultimately might be a true BRT on Washtenaw, I think is wishful thinking.
I'd like to speak up as someone who actually rides the bus from Ypsilanti to Ann Arbor, which I don't think anyone else on this board does. Washtenaw, as someone who uses the bus for transportation, is the better route. There's more, there's hardware stores, there's grocery stores, I do my shopping on the way home. Washtenaw, I live right off the 4 and the 5 and the 6. The 5 is actually the closest route to me, but I ride the 4. It takes me to downtown. We've actually reduced, I'm sad that the 4B was eliminated. That was the one that I favored. But there has been some routing that the bus no longer cuts through. It no longer services the hospital. It goes down Observatory. It does not actually go through the hospital complex anymore. I'm hearing maybe a bit of a lack of understanding of what's actually happening on the bus. So before we spend too much time talking about the routing, I might suggest that some of you ride the bus and then come back with your own experiences.
I wanted to ask Yuval a question of clarification. On scenario 2, am I correct in the assumption in there of the introduction of an express bus between the two terminals from the YTC to the BTC?
Correct. Yeah,
So it's a new service that does not exist today. And do you have a calculation or anything about the travel time savings of that?
we could pull that up. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we could certainly get that.
Hold on a second.
The 1 second.
Sorry, can I jump in here? I want to keep us at a higher level because we're talking about a concept plan. I don't want us to design a BRT alignment or any kind of a frequency or go into too much detailed service design, because that will come later, right? Once you agree on a concept plan, and we think a BRT is a good idea to connect YTC to BTC, and that's where our focus should be. Where the exact alignment of that BRT should be. Right? Serve the hospital first or go to downtown first? I think that those details can be figured out later, because we're really talking about 25-year plan right now. We're not talking about next 5 years. So I would suggest, once you agree on a general concept direction where we're going, and then we can come back with those details later.
So I'm on board with that, but I guess, can I get an answer regarding?
Yeah.
I mean, our area covers Pittston, Superior townships, and I don't really see those in the plan.
Yeah, so in terms of the scenario design, we focused on the member municipalities, and then there are separate discussions that will happen with each of the municipalities. I believe we're presenting to them and talking to them about what is their interest in investing in more transit, because ultimately they, there would be an expectation of cost recovery through those services.
Got it.
So it didn't really make sense, but we do talk about regional connections in a couple slides. But again, we don't, with the expectation that, others that are going to be then using the service need to cover those costs, right? I don't think there's an expectation that the member municipalities would cover those connections outside of the current service area. In terms of, Matt, your question around the express corridor for scenario 2, it represents a 16% travel time savings, or 8-minute travel time saving between the two transit centers. Are we okay to move on? Just, I do want to make sure we get through the rest of the slides, and then, at the end, again, we'll have more discussion on this.
I have one question. It was something I didn't hear you cover. It's on scenario 4, the express service there that goes from YTC, it looks like to, like Wagner Road area via the highway. What was behind that? Or am I misreading that map?
No, you're reading it correctly. I mean, ultimately, there was an opportunity there to introduce an express service from Western Ann Arbor to Ypsilanti, using the interstate there to achieve some substantial travel time savings. It's not necessarily unlike the express services in scenarios 2 and 3, which are 10-minute frequencies, this would be 15-minute frequency. So it's not necessarily a high, it's not necessarily at the same frequency, but ultimately it will provide better connectivity between some of the nodes that are growing on that periphery.
So that was looking to connect people on the east side of the county with the west side of Ann Arbor?
Correct.
And vice versa? Okay.
And passing through the Briarwood Mall terminal that's going to be built up there.
Okay, and without having to go through downtown Ann Arbor.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on, and we'll come back to questions. Again, I recognize there's a lot to go over here. I appreciate your patience. And yeah, if you want to send your comments as well by email afterwards, or other mechanism, please do so. We welcome as much feedback as possible. So next, we're going to look at other elements of the plan that need to be factored into the development. So we're going to discuss options and considerations as they relate to other key services provided by TheRide, as well as potential new services. And these options can be evaluated and ultimately be pursued separately from the scenarios above. So they're each, in some sense, independent choices to be made. So we'll start by talking about regional connections. And the regional connections here also relates to expansion of some park and ride facilities. So, something that we noted around how the current service is built and designed is that there is a limited transit service for regional travel to and from the service area, and that there is a potential for transit to capture some of the growing demand and commutes over the longer term. So what we've envisioned are a series of areas, or we've defined areas where park and rides could be pursued. And then related to each of those park and rides, defined services that would need to be added to connect in the people that are using those. And the details of that are provided to you in the appendix, or high-level notes are provided to you in the appendix. For the public, we're expecting to really just show this level of information. Where you see the 5 green areas, those represent, somewhere where we would look to find and place a park and ride facility, the number of spaces, and then of course, when you add 1,000 or 2,000 parking spaces, there's going to be some need for additional vehicles and service to connect those customers in. There's also expansion of park and ride facilities within the current service area. That's the gray box in the middle there. And so that would represent 2,000 to 3,000 locations. And also we've are looking at 2 regional connections, regional services to Canton and to Detroit, which are shown there. One thing to note regarding all of the regional connection elements here is that we're expecting, or basically saying that outside funding would be essential to building those, and that we're not expecting to use local taxes to provide the service to people commuting in or out from outside. With regards to paratransit, we're planning service based on 3 principles as laid out on the slide. So the first is around a focus on continued compliance with the ADA, with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Specifically, as we look at expanded service areas in scenarios 2, 3, and 4, you're going to need to expand the coverage area for your ADA service, for A-Ride. As well, if you're extending service into the evenings, as I mentioned was happening in a couple of the scenarios as well, you would need to extend the coverage for A-Ride in the evenings to basically to ensure you're continuing to be compliant with the regulations in 2045. And so this would translate to a need for additional service hours to meet that capacity, and to make sure that you're meeting the demands of the time. The second principle is around looking for ways to enhance accessibility and efficiency system-wide. So we're not just saying within A-Ride, but system-wide, look for ways to enhance accessibility and efficiency, which will help you then reduce the demand on your A-Ride service. So that would include continuing to respond to service requests for contracted services with mechanisms for full cost recovery from other municipalities. That would be one element of that. Focusing door-to-door services for riders with functional limitations and expanding service options for others. Designing for integration with fixed route trips where possible, as well as other service lines. And ultimately what we mean by that is really viewing some of your other service lines like Gold Ride, Flex Ride, My Ride as part of an integrated service delivery model that all work together to help ease or reduce requirements of your A-Ride service, which ultimately is the most expensive service to operate. And then the third element to the paratransit strategy is around maximizing use of appropriate technologies. So things like customer booking, communications technology, vehicle location monitoring, so on. They help you be more efficient, but they also help you provide better service and a higher quality service to customers. They help customers feel more comfortable using the conventional services, which again reduces the demand there. And so those are the key strategies that we're calling for paratransit. Next, I want to share a
question on the 4 scenarios that we talked about vary a little bit in geographic coverage, whereas here you're suggesting a $1 million increase in annual operational costs. That wouldn't that be more of a range?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And
sorry to
clarify.
Yeah, so it averages out to that, but the reality is, we have slightly different numbers, but ultimately the service area between 2, 3, and 4 doesn't change that much. Definitely compared to 1, it does, because we're providing service to all of Ypsilanti Township. But the other 3 scenarios have largely the same geographies, and so they largely have the same A-Ride costs, A-Ride costs. Does that address your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay. So moving on.
I just have one observation here. The 1% annual growth in ridership for A-Ride. I'm just surprised to see it that being that low for what the kind of assumptions you've talked about.
Okay, so I think part of it, and Dennis can feel free to jump in with more details, but I mean, there's a couple aspects to that. One is obviously considering the aging demographics of the community and sort of just the general propensity for the use of these service, but then balancing that out against how many people are using the other services that I talked about. And again, creating accessible alternatives for people to use. Dennis, did you want to jump in with further details on that?
Yeah, I think, it is more or less in line with the overall increase in the population, which is, similar to what we were talking about with the fixed route, sort of, 25, 30, 35%, something like that over the 25 years. It does take into account the aging of the population. So the shift is going to be the much older, the 85 plus is going to get quite a bit larger. The 65 to 84 is going to increase some, but the younger population, which makes up about half of the A-Ride ridership, less than age 65, also goes down as we move in. And then as we get out towards the end of the 25-year period, the boom, the aging population phenomenon is done. And so it starts to balance off. That also takes into account, some ability to offset the specific door-to-door A-Ride service with the kinds of variety of services that you've all talked about.
Any further questions? Can we move on? A couple more slides. So we've also been exploring other ideas that can be integrated with the scenarios previously shown. So these ideas vary from new technologies, improved supporting infrastructure, and new potential services. And so some of those are on the slide that you see there. It should be noted that there's a longer list of ideas that we're exploring, and that list includes recommendations from other studies, such as the FAIR strategy that was done. More broadly, the plan, and I'll talk about this shortly, the plan will identify that technology is expected to evolve over the next 25 years. And so while we can look at specific technologies today and deem them, ready for prime time or not, it's imperative that the agency really track and look at new and emerging technologies or innovations on an ongoing basis as they develop and as they mature. And then we also are through our work going to look at other strategies to improve transit success. And so, we've lumped those into two buckets for now. The first is around increasing collaboration. And so some examples of that are working with the RTA to just improve service to major regional destinations. And so some of the things that we talked about on the previous slide, some of those would be developed and pursued in collaboration with the RTA. With the University of Michigan, there's really an opportunity to improve service planning, collaboration, coordination as it relates to services in those shared service areas. With the area municipalities, working with your municipal partners on land use development and urban design to really ensure that transit supportive development is considered as municipalities are looking at zoning and whatnot. And then with transit supportive organization and advocates, harnessing their knowledge, passion to improve transit, and really allowing them and enabling them to be advocates on your behalf. That's a very powerful thing as well. From an organizational excellence perspective, and I touched on this earlier, really being ready and open to regularly evaluating emerging technologies. So as an example, autonomous vehicles, it's anybody's guess where we will be in 5 years or 10 years with AVs. There's some municipalities that are piloting it, and there's some jurisdictions where it's being piloted with one vehicle. But to the extent that it will be able to completely replace your service in 25 years, I don't think anyone would be willing to stake money on it. And so, like electric vehicles, being ready to pivot and being ready to use those technologies once they are ready for prime time. I think it's really about creating that culture within the organization of tracking and reviewing and leveraging those technologies when they're ready. Also, investigating the future of contracted service to municipalities is something that we've been looking at and talking about. And at what point does it make sense, or is there an appetite, to look at other municipalities and work with other municipalities, or possibly have them join the membership, right? If that's something that works, but that ultimately it needs to be beneficial for all of the member municipalities that are involved right now to provide services to those peripheral or to those neighboring entities. Updating service standards and introducing supportive land use and transportation guidelines. That's important for an agency to be successful. And then the last bullet on here, just around improving supplier management and contract structures, so that really all of your vendors, any vendors that the agency has, are really delivering against a set of performance requirements that meet your needs and allow you to achieve the outputs that you want. So for the next slide, which is around advocacy, I'm actually going to hand it over to Matt. He's going to talk a little bit about the importance for advocacy in something like this.
Thank you, Yuval. I'm going to be very brief. This is a political slide. Much of what we've just spoken about has to do with the supply of transportation, how we shape and target our product, if you will. There's the supply side, but there's also the demand side. Much of what, frankly, affects people's interest in taking public transit is on the demand side. How much does it cost to own and operate a car? How much is parking? Can you find a convenient parking stall? How much does gas cost? Are you living in a 1 acre plot of land in a single family house, or are you living in a high rise? These are very important issues that have a huge effect, frankly, on our ability to increase the ridership per capita and get to some of the goals and targets that these scenarios want to get to. Identifying a platform, an advocacy platform, things we would like to see happen, that's not too hard. That path has been done before. The real question comes down to how assertive do we want to be in our local political environment in pursuing these things. And for just use a recent example, there's a big difference politically in being invited into the city of Ann Arbor's rezoning for transit-oriented development, which we were. And there's a big difference between that and one of us showing up at a planning commission meeting and telling them that they're doing it wrong, and we have a better idea on how they should be doing their jobs. Sometimes municipalities are very happy to get that kind of feedback. Sometimes not so much. I can imagine a scenario if we choose to be very assertive in the future, where perhaps I'm to show up at a planning commission meeting to testify and support some high-rise developments in some residential areas that the local community and residents are very against, which could earn the ire of a future council member. So it is an inherently political kind of discussion, and the platform itself is not hard to develop, but the question really comes down to what's our appetite for being involved in some of these more controversial local things. And again, this one can operate independently of the other ones. It's just an appetite for risk sort of question. That's all. Thank you, Yuval.
Great, thank you. Okay, so from there, we're just going to shift. I want to briefly, I actually swapped the order of slides that in my deck here. So Pia, if the next slide should be the what's next slide. And I just wanted to quickly touch on the what's next so that we can then end on all of the discussion without having to rush back to do one more slide. So just what's next for us. So we have obviously further work on developing all of our materials for public engagement. And so that's what we're going to be heads down over the next couple of weeks doing. And then through October and November, we have a bunch of engagement activities planned with the customers, with stakeholders, with political bodies as well. And ultimately, we're soliciting as much feedback as possible, and we welcome yours, of course, as well. And sorry, we also are meeting with doing staff town halls at that time too, I should mention. So looking internally as well, not just externally for feedback. And then December is going to be around is for using that feedback to drive further analysis, new iterations, and to start narrowing in on a single vision for transit. And then, Q1 of next year, beginning our final round of engagement with you, of course, and then from there to the customers, stakeholders, and others, with the intention of looking or seeking approval from the board late Q1 into early Q2 of next year. So that's sort of just to give you a sense of what's next. It goes without saying, we're looking for as much of your feedback as you're willing to give. I know we don't have a lot of time left today, but anything you have to share afterwards, we're welcome to, we would welcome that feedback as well. So then with that said, if we can now shift to the 3 questions that we have, and I'll open it up for the floor, and Mr. Chair, if you want to take it away, or if you'd like me to just field the questions directly, that's fine as well.
No, you can field the questions. I just think it makes, I'm not sure how you want to, since I'm just kind of looking at this for the first time, do you want people to comment on number 1, then number 2, or then number 3, or address all 3 of these at once? What's going to be most helpful for the group?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, maybe it's easier if we go around the table, and if people want to address one or all of these questions, that would be fine. And if
Sure.
there's some conversation, that's fine too.
Since we have about 15, a little over 15 minutes left, I think it's a good idea to go around the table and just kind of see what board members have to say. So if anyone wants to start with their thoughts about this discussion, I'd like to give everybody a chance to speak once, at least once, before anybody speaks twice. So who wants to lead us off with their thoughts on these? Raven, go ahead.
Yeah, first I want to commend the team for the work that went into this, both TheRide as well as the LTRT team. I actually am kind of impressed with some of the ambitious plans identified herein. I think, one of the things that I just want to encourage all of us to do is have a little bit of an out-of-body experience when we think about this. And by that, I mean, don't focus on how you use transit or how you want to use transit. Yuval and the consultant team is looking at the data, right? They don't have a dog in the fight in terms of which area is served and which area isn't served. And at the end of the day, it really comes down, ridership is really a function of density. It's either population density or employment density. So, when we had discussions about Washtenaw versus Packard, if you think about it, Washtenaw has the density. That's why Washtenaw makes sense, because it has more magnets on it that attracts people to that transit. So, and then the other thing I'll also say is, I also don't think we should be too sheepish about how ambitious we want to be with this. There's been a lot of groundwork in other documents, especially from the city's perspective, that says we are looking to major shifts in transportation movement and how people get around. And so if that does require, reduction of lanes on Washtenaw, I don't think we should shy away from that, because that groundwork has already been laid. I'm not going to say it's easy. I'm not kidding myself that it will be. But if we aren't ambitious now, why are we doing this? Then we may as well just pick status quo right now and stay the course. So I just think that if we are going to achieve kind of the goals we have as an organization, as well as the goals we have as a community, transit is a key factor in all of that. And I think we need to be ambitious. So thanks to the team. I like the direction it's going. I like some of the bold plans that are identified therein. And I'm interested to see what the rest of the board members think, as well as the public.
Who wants to go next? Just jump in.
Okay. I was hoping for something a little more transformational, I guess. It seems like what we're doing is, let's just keep doing what we're doing, but keep doing more and more of it, and people will flock to the buses. I think if you really want to change the way that people look at transportation, I'm talking about riders of choice, it can't be 5 or 10 minutes here. It needs to be, 20 minutes or 30 minutes or something. It needs to be something that really gets people that are used to driving to look and say, hey, this is actually a better way of doing it. And I just think putting out more and more service, more and more frequent service and later service isn't going to make that transformational shift in the riders of choice that I think we're going to need if the downtown and the center of the city is going to continue to, of Ann Arbor, is going to continue to be prosperous. Susan and I have both know that there's probably not going to be a whole lot of more parking built downtown. So transit's really going to be, the savior. And I would like to see something, I guess, a little more transformational than just, let's just keep adding more service on more routes and people will come to, and.
But let's pressure test that, Roger, because what do you mean by transformational? I mean, it sounds good in theory, but what do you mean? Do you want jetpacks? Do you want hoverboard?
No, I think
Hyperloops?
no, I think high capacity corridors are the way to go. But I think we're trying to squeeze them in where they're not going to fit very well or fit at all. Or if they do fit, it could be, 25 or 30 years from now. No, but I guess I would like to see a system where maybe there is one large dedicated right of way that goes all the way from Plymouth Road through the medical center, Central Campus, downtown, Briarwood, and out to Ipsy, and then have branches that feed into that. And the branches don't all have to be fixed route. They can be Flex Ride or Uber, Lyft, or any of the zillion of other transportation ideas out there. But yeah, I would look at more of one major central high capacity corridor rather than a number of them that you still have to do interchanges with if you want to get to different employment areas. So you shouldn't have to go from Ipsy, from the Blake or from YTC to the Blake, then change buses if you want to go to Central Campus. I think there are a number of ways to do that be more than just expanding the existing structure.
Okay. Next, who wants to go next? Rich? We can't hear you, Rich, whatever you're saying.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
No? Okay. Yeah, so the thing for me was with Roger mentioning the part about transformational. When I looked at the agenda and I was like, elements of the plan, and number 4, which is the other services, is where I really honed in. I was like, oh, okay, this is something where we're actually going to look at something beyond just like fixed route, right? And then I go down, I'm like trying to find the slide, there's like all these other slides. And then I get to basically slide 29. And I think that's pretty much it, right? And I'm going, oh man, like there's so much good stuff in there that I think we need to really consider, especially the parts in that top right, which is like a high priority, high value implementation around that first and last mile solutions of like, well, we need to look at e-scooters and bike share, et cetera. And so I love that it's part of it, but it just feels like it's just been kind of like slipped into this deck and it really isn't a priority, even though according to this chart, it's a very high priority to look at. So I think my only suggestion is maybe you can leave this slide here, but maybe add a couple more slides, because I don't know if this is the deck you're going to present to the public, but I think it would be helpful for them to know, like, yes, we are viewing ourselves as a transportation authority of trying to look at different alternative ways instead of just like big buses, which serve our community really well, but we are looking at 25 years out, what are we potentially going to be using? So that was one of the suggestions I had. But again, I want to mirror what Raymond said, like, thank you for putting this together. I mean, this is a great start for us to consider and to really get some feedback. Just deck wise, if we could mention who the stakeholders and municipalities are, because I would bet a large number of the public doesn't know that. Again, this is just assuming this deck is going to be presented to them. And the other just kind of goes to my other question of, hey, we are also looking at Pittsville and Superior, because if we want buy-in, we got to start getting them into this conversation very early on, even if we aren't targeting them for like these feedback groups, which I hope you are at some point. And the last thing is just in those maps where you kind of show like those percentages that I question, just have another slide that shows these are the areas that we are really focused on with these statistics and why these decisions were made, and go from there. Thanks. Actually, can I maybe, I'm sorry, I just remember one thing. So you asked about the costs and benefits. I didn't really say anything in here much around costs, so I don't know how to comment on that.
It's in the appendix for you. Sorry, yeah, it's in the appendix.
But I thought that was just park and ride share costs, right? Oh, so like the KPI financials. Okay, got it. All right, thanks.
Who wants to go next? Kyra or Susan or Mike, Kathleen?
Yeah, I'll make a few comments. Thank you very much. This has been very eye-opening for me, and has given me a lot of food for thought that I will continue to chew on. But let me bring up one thing that concerns me that has been just referenced but not really talked about. Certainly one of the major objectives that you had up front was to get some really good community feedback on this. And this is going to be tailored for the community. But my impression has been that in the past, for the ride, trying to get feedback on routes, trying to get feedback on things like the budget, the meetings have not been as well attended as they should have been. And furthermore, things like, in particular, service planning, has gotten certain groups of people who come because they have particular narrow issues. And I think that we haven't been able to get good cross sections of our riders. And I think it's really important that we do. And in addition to getting a good cross section of our riders, because we're trying to get more riders, people out of their cars, it's really important. And I don't know how you're going to do it, but it's really important to get a good cross section of the community that includes potential riders who are not currently riders. And boy, I think that's going to be difficult, but boy, is it important.
Okay. Others? Kathleen or Jesse or?
I can jump in. I was really excited about this the presentation. For me, the reason we exist is to be able to allow people to satisfy their daily transportation needs using public transportation without a need for personal transportation or personally owned transportation. And this seems to be in keeping with that. You seem to be keeping that as a guiding focus. I would like to echo some things like with Rich. I'd like to see more in this presentation about other kind of auxiliary service improvements. Like me personally, a big priority is more equitable and accessible fare collection. I feel like we've got a lot of room for improvement there. So I think that could be useful. Oh shoot, I lost my. I should have waited until I finished writing up my notes before I spoke. Yeah, I guess I'll have to leave it at that until I think of it.
Oh, jump back in if you do. Kyra or Susan or Kathleen? Anybody?
Just a brief thing. It came up this morning in the service committee about the benefit accruing to the community versus the cost. And what we were talking about is the millages in Ann Arbor are generating a great deal of money, and whether or not the community is seeing the benefit if the service is being provided in Ypsilanti or Ypsi Township. It's just, I had raised the point there, and I'll raise it again. I think we have to think more broadly about the benefit coming back to the taxpayers, no matter which municipality they're living in. Anything we can do to get people to shift from a single occupancy vehicle benefits us all. And anything we can do to build the economies of all of our communities benefits us all. And I think we have to find new ways of describing the benefit. When the millage in 14 was put forward, it was a very simple calculation, X amount of money versus X amount of service within each city, or, you know, the township of Ypsi. And I don't know that it can be calculated that way. If we can get people to fill open positions and jobs, there's an economic benefit that is harder to describe. And I think this is an opportunity to begin to expand people's thinking about why we benefit when we all work together, as opposed to thinking very partisanly about our particular municipal boundaries and whether I, as an Ann Arbor resident, get my money's worth versus Ypsi Township or Ypsi. So just that we touched on that dialogue in this plan may be a chance to expand our thinking about how benefits and costs are calculated and accrued.
I remembered my final thoughts. Is that I think it's going to be important for us. This is kind of talking more to Matt's question about how active we want to be. I think this is important, and if we don't advocate for it, then no one is. We don't have any local public transportation advocacy agencies where we have to serve that role. And I think the cities aren't, and the municipalities aren't going to necessarily be thinking about it unless we put it in place. And it's going to be really important for us to drive home how well this integrates in with their climate and equity goals that they have in place. And I think anytime a discussion's happening regarding A20, we should be there saying, you know how you reduce transportation emissions and particulates from, you get people out of individual single occupant vehicles and get them into buses or mass transportation. So I want to be, I feel like because no one else is going to do it, that's where we need to be.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay. There's nobody else. My own personal thoughts are these. I think, again, the apex consideration. I've heard the word transformative or transformational quite a bit, and we should start shooting for the moon. I have no problem with that, but the issue, as we've all talked about, is cost and what things are going to cost. And so the specific feedback I want to know from the public is, what are you willing to pay to make this happen? We're drawing. We can talk about, queue jump lanes and hyperloops. I think we have to measure the political will, and it is going to be tough. Transformation is a tough sell if people don't think the system is fine the way it is. And our last millage told us that people like what they're getting from us as it is, at least by 84%. They told us, hey, we like the job you're doing. So to go out them and say, no, we need a lot more money, because in 25 years, we're going to want to upend this whole thing, is going to be a tough sell. So we really have to come up with something compelling to make people understand that, what's working now is not going to work. So scenario one is not going to keep working, the status quo, and transformational change is what is going to be required, not just it's going to be compelled. We're going to be compelled to do it. That's going to be a tough sell. And what people are going to, everybody wants to do transformational change until they see the bill. And then when they see the bill, they're going to say, whoa, we don't need that much transformation. That's my concern here. So I think, maybe in 25 years, but we're going to have to do this incrementally. If we go out with, I'm concerned if we go out with a big scenario 4 plan and say, hey, in 25 years we want to look like this. I worry about the reaction of the public as opposed to maybe a series of 5 to 7 year plans or breaking this into chunks. That would be a much easier, I think, approach to doing this. That's just, I don't think we can underestimate Matt's point about the advocacy. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of the actual messaging and how we frame this up. So I'm going to be looking at it through that lens and probably deciding, all right, what's the best slice to take out of the first chunk, the second chunk, and the third chunk as we go incrementally through this. I want to make sure I give anybody else a chance. Is there anybody else who wants to go? Because we are a couple minutes over time and I want to be respectful of people's time. Anybody else who wants to jump in at this point? If not, I can give it back to Yuval or Matt.
Thanks. I'll just do a quick rapid fire response to the feedback. I'm not going to try to address any one comment there. I do appreciate, a lot of, pretty much the entire group wants to see, or spoke of the desire for transformational change, obviously understanding that there's a cost to that and what will that look like and will people get behind it. And hearing that there's some variation in terms of what people view as transformational, I think that's something that we'll continue to probe as we move forward. There were a couple points of feedback around what information was in the deck and what wasn't, and we'll definitely take that away as well in terms of what is the right level of information to bring to the public. The services that we talked about, all of those extra things that I think it was Rich, you mentioned you would have liked to see more. I can assure you there's a lot more. As you can see, we already had a lot of stuff we wanted to go over, and we just are trying to balance where's the right time. And yeah, so I think you're probably right. There's probably more to be done in that space in terms of conveying everything that's been done, and we'll look to do that with other stakeholders. So yeah, I appreciate all of that feedback and anything else that comes to mind from the group subsequent to today. If you can filter that information back. Ultimately your feedback is what will make our engagement that much better and that much more successful on your behalf. So with that, maybe I'll pass it back to Matt if you have any final things you wanted to comment on.
Only to thank the board for your patience, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Take what you've heard today, mull it around, think about it, sleep on it. Give me a call anytime, give Forrest a call, send us your comments by email. Anything we can do to pick your brain, to clarify any of these things. I learned a bunch today that I didn't know. So it's a good process and it will continue. We look forward to bringing it forward. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We turn it back to you for the rest of the meeting.
Okay. Topics for the next meeting. I think our board packet will come out soon. 3.2 is public comment. Kelly, do we have anybody who's waiting to address the board?
Those who would like to comment, please use the raise hand icon on the bottom of your screen, and I will call your name and allow you to participate. If you are dialing in by phone, please use *9, and I will read off the last 3 digits of your phone number. And we have Mr. Robert Pulowski.
Good evening, everyone. Robert Pulowski here from Southgate and Wayne County. I'd just like to give some credit to the Ride and Left Turn, Right Turn team for all the hard work they put into that presentation. The presentation was well done. I liked every aspect of it, especially the tech upgrade with the off-board fare collection, the bus rapid transit, all of it. This really gives me, it really relates to Cleveland and what they have now. But this plan is more extreme than what Cleveland has in place now. 2 bus rapid transit lines in a small little college town compared to 1 little bus rapid transit line within a huge city within Cuyahoga County. That's going to be changing the game here compared to what's over at Cleveland. So that's something I really look forward to see going forward with this plan. But I do want to get on the point of what Raymond said. We need to be more ambitious when it comes to getting more people and bringing more riders into the system. We need to be more ambitious on that. And I also like to piggyback on Richard's point during the presentation with getting Superior Township and Saline and Pittsfield Township having the ride come into those areas. I definitely agree with that. That needs to be something right there. And that's also ties in with Raymond's point. If we want to be more ambitious, we got to have some of these communities. We got to sit down with them and give them a layout and show them the benefits, what residents can endure with this. It's something that really needs to be looked into. So I hope to see that. But other than that, the park and ride buses, the fleet, yeah, the upgrade on the fleet's going to need to be done. It's probably, I'm taking a random guess that it's going to be similar to what the park and ride buses are in Cleveland. I look forward to seeing that. But other than that, it was a great presentation, and I really hope to see more in the coming years and throughout my lifetime as these years go by to see how this system can grow. And especially with the travel times, those are hopefully can improve within the plan. I hope to see those improve soon, but wonderful plan, and I can't wait to see the system grow. But thank you so much for the opportunity and time to speak, and I hope you have a good rest of your night. Take care now.
Thank you. Kelly, do we have anybody else?
No additional questions at this time.
Thank you. We'll close the public comment, and can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Richard, seconded by Mike. And we'll go through the list. Yes or no, Mike?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Excuse me, Raymond?
Yes.
Roger?
Yes.
Jesse?
Yes.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Susan?
Yes.
Tyra?
Yes.
And I'm also yes. All right. I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the night.
Thank you all.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.